I never thought I'd become the neighborhood hero for standing up to our HOA president, but when Karen Wilkinson targeted the Jensen family while their son was fighting for his life, someone had to draw the line. It started on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon when I noticed a crew setting up a temporary ramp at the Jensen's home. Their 8-year-old son Tyler had been diagnosed with leukemia, and after his most recent round of chemotherapy, he would need wheelchair access for at least several months. The Jensens had been through enough already, with medical bills piling up and taking turns staying overnight at the hospital. The last thing they needed was HOA drama. But drama found them anyway in the form of Karen Wilkinson, our 50-something HOA president with her signature platinum blonde bob and perpetually pursed lips. I was watering my front garden when I saw her marching across the street, clipboard in hand, designer sunglasses perched on her nose despite the cloudy day. "Excuse me," she called out to the workers, her voice carrying that fake sweet tone that always preceded trouble. "Do you have approval from the Architectural Review Committee for this structure?" She gestured at the ramp with obvious distaste, as if it were a carnival ride rather than a medical necessity. One of the workers explained the situation, mentioning Tyler's condition, but Karen was unmoved. "Rules are rules," she said with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "The Jensens need to submit proper documentation and wait for approval. This needs to come down immediately." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Setting down my watering can, I crossed the street to intervene. "Karen, you can't be serious," I said, keeping my voice level despite my rising anger. "Tyler's coming home from the hospital tomorrow. He literally cannot enter his home without this ramp." Karen turned to me with that tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh, hello, Mark. I understand your concern, but no one is above the HOA regulations. They signed the covenant when they purchased the home." She tapped her clipboard importantly. "If we make exceptions, where does it end? Rainbow-colored houses? Car repairs in driveways? Absolute chaos." "This is a medical necessity," I countered, feeling my professional composure slipping. "The Fair Housing Act protects reasonable accommodations for disabilities. This isn't about aesthetics. It's about a child being able to enter his own home." Karen's eyes narrowed behind her designer frames. "Are you a lawyer now, Mark? The Jensens need to go through proper channels. Period. If this ramp isn't removed by tomorrow morning, they'll be fined $100 per day." With that, she pivoted on her heel and strode away, leaving the workers looking uncomfortable and me absolutely fuming. I immediately took photos of the ramp installation and headed over to the hospital to speak with David and Lisa Jensen. When I explained what happened, Lisa burst into tears. They had notified the HOA via email last week about the temporary ramp but received no response. David looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from watching your child suffer while trying to keep your family afloat. "We can't afford fines on top of everything else," Lisa whispered, clutching her husband's hand. "But Tyler's coming home tomorrow. What are we supposed to do? Carry him up the stairs when he's in pain from treatment?" "You won't have to," I promised. "Karen's overstepping, and she knows it. Let me handle this." That evening, I did my research. I printed out relevant sections of the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and even found a few case precedents where HOAs had been successfully sued for preventing reasonable accommodations for medical needs. I also discovered that our own HOA bylaws had a medical emergency exception clause that Karen had conveniently overlooked. The next morning, I was ready when Karen arrived at the Jensen home with her clipboard and a smug expression. The ramp was still there, and Tyler was scheduled to come home that afternoon. "I warned you about the consequences," Karen said loudly enough for the neighbors who were pretending not to watch. $100 per day, starting today." I stepped forward, file folder in hand. "Actually, Karen, I've done some research you might find interesting." I handed her the documents I'd prepared. The ramp is protected under federal law as a reasonable accommodation for a medical necessity. Additionally, Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our own bylaws provides exceptions for temporary medical structures with notification, which the Jensens provided last week. Karen's face flushed as she flipped through the papers. This is irrelevant. The Architectural Review Committee still needs to approve the design and materials." The committee has 14 days to respond to emergency requests, I countered smoothly. In the absence of a response, temporary approval is automatically granted. It's right there in our bylaws. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered by this point, watching with undisguised interest. Karen's lips thinned to a barely visible line as she realized she was losing her audience. "This isn't over," she hissed, shoving the papers back at me. "I'll be discussing this at the board meeting tonight." I smiled pleasantly. "I'll be there. And I've invited a representative from the Fair Housing Commission to join us. They seemed very interested in our HOA's policies regarding medical accommodations." That was a bluff, but Karen didn't know that. She stalked away without another word, and several neighbors came over to offer support for the Jensens. One even mentioned that Karen had fined them for having a basketball hoop that was the wrong shade of black. Another had been cited for flowering plants that weren't on the approved vegetation list. That evening, the monthly HOA board meeting was more crowded than usual. Word had spread about the Jensen situation, and people were taking sides. Most supported the family, but Karen had her loyal faction, mostly older residents who believed property values would plummet if rules weren't strictly enforced. Karen called the meeting to order, her voice dripping with authority as she adjusted the microphone. "Before we address the agenda items, I'd like to discuss a serious violation occurring at 47 Maple Drive. The Jensen property has installed an unapproved structural addition without proper authorization." I stood up immediately. "Point of order. This issue isn't on the published agenda, which according to our bylaws means it cannot be voted on tonight." Karen's eyes flashed with irritation. "This is an emergency enforcement issue that the board can address at any meeting." Then I moved to classify the temporary wheelchair ramp at the Jensen residence as a medical necessity exemption under Section 7 of our bylaws, I countered, knowing I had the room's support. "Their son is coming home from the hospital today after cancer treatment." A murmur spread through the room, and I could see Karen realizing she was losing control of the narrative. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "The appearance of our neighborhood affects everyone's property values," she insisted, her voice rising. "If we allow one unapproved structure, soon we'll have sheds and carports and all manner of eyesores. The Jensens knew the rules when they moved here." That's when Lisa Jensen, who had slipped into the back of the room, stood up. Her voice shook slightly, but her words carried clearly through the room. "My son just wants to come home from the hospital with some dignity. The ramp is temporary, just like we hope his wheelchair will be. Is your property value really worth more than my child's well-being?" The room fell silent. Karen looked around, sensing the shift in mood, but pressed on with remarkable tone-deafness. "This isn't about one child. This is about the integrity of our community standards. The fine stands until proper approval is granted." David Jensen stood beside his wife now. "Our son has been fighting leukemia for 7 months. We submitted our request electronically last week with doctor's documentation. We've followed your precious procedures." Karen shuffled through some papers, clearly flustered. "I don't see any record of that submission." That's when I played my trump card. I projected an email onto the screen at the front of the room, the Jensen's original request, with Karen's own reply, "Received. Will review." "You acknowledged receipt, Karen," I said calmly. "And according to our bylaws, the committee then has 14 days to respond or the temporary request is automatically approved." Karen's face went from pink to deep red. She stood up abruptly, knocking over her water bottle. "This meeting is out of order. I'm the president of this association, and I decide what constitutes an emergency exemption." "Actually," came a new voice from the back, "the bylaws clearly state that medical necessities qualify automatically." It was Roger Simmons, a retired attorney who rarely attended meetings. "And denying reasonable accommodations for a disability, yes, temporary disabilities count, is a violation of federal law that could result in fines of up to $100,000 to the association." The mood in the room shifted dramatically. Board members exchanged nervous glances. Karen seemed to sense she was losing her grip on power, and that's when she made her fatal mistake. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, slamming her hand on the table. I am not going to let the integrity of this neighborhood be destroyed by people who don't respect the rules. The Jensens will be fined, and if necessary, we'll place a lien on their property." She pointed directly at me. "And you're violating the homeowner code of conduct by inciting rebellion against the board. Your landscaping violations have been overlooked for too long." The room erupted in voices. Karen repeatedly banged her gavel, demanding order, her face contorted with rage. When that didn't work, she did the unthinkable. She marched over to where the Jensens stood and thrust her finger in Lisa's face. "Your son's condition doesn't put you above the rules the rest of us follow," she screamed, completely losing composure. "Remove the ramp or face the consequences." What happened next would later go viral on 3 different social media platforms. Lisa Jensen, the soft-spoken kindergarten teacher who had never raised her voice in public, slapped Karen's pointing finger away from her face. Karen gasped dramatically, clutching her hand as if she'd been gravely injured. "She assaulted me. Call 911. I want her arrested." To everyone's shock, Karen actually pulled out her phone and dialed emergency services, claiming she had been violently attacked at a public meeting. The room fell into stunned silence as she described being accosted by an unhinged woman, and demanded police presence immediately. 20 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived, looking distinctly unimpressed to be called to an HOA dispute. They interviewed several witnesses, all of whom confirmed that Karen had been the aggressor, pointing in Lisa's face, and that Lisa had merely pushed the finger away from her personal space. What Karen hadn't realized was that Roger Simmons had been recording the meeting on his phone, a practice specifically allowed in our bylaws for record-keeping purposes. The officers reviewed the footage, which clearly showed Karen's finger-pointing and aggressive behavior. To Karen's obvious shock, instead of arresting Lisa Jensen, the senior officer turned to her. "Ma'am, you do realize that filing a false police report is a crime, right?" "False? She hit me," Karen protested, holding up her perfectly uninjured hand. "The video clearly shows you invaded her personal space and she defended herself with reasonable force," the officer replied calmly. "Additionally, I've been informed that you're attempting to enforce housing restrictions that violate the Fair Housing Act." The other officer was taking notes now. "We're going to need to file a report about this incident. Can I see some identification, please?" Karen's face went from red to ashen. "This is absurd. I'm the victim here." "Ma'am, your ID, please," the officer repeated firmly. As Karen fumbled for her purse, the first officer continued, "Filing a false police report is a class A misdemeanor in this state, punishable by up to 1 year in jail and fines up to $2,500. The room was dead silent as Karen was escorted outside to complete the police report. Through the windows, we could see her gesticulating wildly, her composure completely shattered. The remaining board members quickly called an emergency vote. The result was unanimous. The Jensen family's temporary ramp was approved retroactively, Karen Wilkinson was removed as HOA president effective immediately, and the board issued a formal apology to the family. 3 days later, Karen was formally charged with filing a false police report, and the judge set her bail at $5,000. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her designer sunglasses askew and her perfectly coiffed hair disheveled, she caught sight of me in the gallery. The look of utter disbelief and rage on her face as she realized her petty kingdom had crumbled was something I'll never forget.